Good morning, sir. Good morning, everyone. We are presenting now the topic that is assigned to us. Synthesis Making Informed Decision by Group 3.
The moral agent and context. What one ought to do in one's life is not dictated by one's physical, interpersonal, social, or historical conditions. What one ought to do is also not abstracted from one's own specific situation. One always comes from somewhere. One is always continuously being shaped by many factors outside of one's own free will. The human individual thus always exists in the tension between being conditioned by external factors and being a free agent. The moral agent is not a calculating, unfeeling machine that produces completely objective and absolutely correct solution to even the most complex moral problems. What one ought to do in one's life is not dictated. Sabi dito, ang karapatan ng isang taong mamuhay ay hindi kailangan diktahan ng isang physical man o pang-interpersonal or pang-social o mismong pang-historical condition. Dahil ang bawat tao sa kanyang buhay ay kailangang mamuhay ng karapat-dapat na hindi kailangan diktahan ng iba. What one ought to do is also not abstracted from one's own specific situation. Sabi rin dito, na ang isang tao, yung kanyang karapatan o yung kanyang dapat gawin ay hindi kailangang makuha mula sa isang specific situation lamang. One always comes from somewhere. So, ang isang gawain ng isang tao ay galing sa kanyang abilidad mismo. One is always continuously being shaped by many factors outside of one's own free will. Ang isang tao sa kanyang gawain or sa kanyang buhay sa araw-araw ay patuloy na hinuhulma ng panahon sa kanyang sariling kalayaan. Dahil meron siyang karapatang mamuhay at may karapatan din siyang ihulma ang kanyang sariling buhay. The human individual does always exist in the tension between being conditioned by external factors and being free agent. So, ang bawat individual sa humanidad ng isang tao ay nag-i-exist, or sa madaling salita ay ang buhay ng isang tao ay namamayagpag sa kanyang buhay at sa kanyang pamumuhay. The moral agent is not calculating. So yun nga, yung moral agent daw natin ay hindi kailangan i-calculate para lang mapatunayan kung talagang karapat-dapat mo ito. Unfeeling machine that produces completely objective and absolutely correct solution to even the most complex moral problems. So yung moral agent mo ay hindi kailangan i-calcula kung anong solution yung kailangan mong gawin. Kung hindi masusolusyonan mo ito kapag inisip mo sa sarili mo na ito dapat yung kailangan gawin, ito dapat yung kailangang ayusin, at ito dapat yung kailangang patunayan para maayos mo yung mga complex moral problems mo.
Culture and ethics. A common opinion many people hold is that one's culture dictates what is right or wrong for an individual. For such people, the saying, "When in Rome, does as Romans do," by Saint Ambrose applies to deciding on moral issues. This quote implies that one's culture is inescapable, that is, one has to look into the standards of her society to resolve her ethical questions with penalty. How she relates to herself, her close relations, her own society with other societies, and with the natural world are all predetermined by her membership in her society and culture. Generalization concerning supposed Filipino traits sometimes end up as empty stereotypes, especially since one may be hard put to think it if any other culture does not exhibit such traits. For instance, in the case of what many assume is a trait that Filipinos possess, namely hospitality, can we say that Chinese are not hospitable? Most probably they are hospitable too, but there many exhibit such hospitality in radically different ways. Thus, to simply say that there is a Filipino way of doing things, including a Filipino way of thinking about what the right thing to do and why, remains a matter for decision. Is there really a Filipino morality that may be distinct from a Chinese morality? We hear claims from time to time that Americans are individualistic, Filipinos are communal, a supposed difference that grounds for some people radically different sets of moral values. The American philosopher James Heschel, 1941-2003, provided a clear argument against the validity of cultural relativism in the realm of ethics. Heschel defines cultural relativism as the position that claims that there is no such thing as objective truth in the realm of morality. The argument of this position is that since different cultures have different moral codes, then there is no one correct moral code that all cultures must follow. The implication is that each culture has its own standard of right or wrong, its validity confined within the culture in question. Beyond this criticism of the logic of cultural relativism, Heschel also employs a reduction ad absurdum argument. He posits three absurd consequences of accepting the claim of cultural relativism. First, if cultural relativism was correct, then one cannot criticize the practices or beliefs of another culture anymore, as long as that culture thinks that what it is doing is correct. But that is the case when the Jews, for example, cannot criticize the Nazis' plan to exterminate all Jews in World War II, since obviously the Nazis believed that they were doing the right thing. Secondly, if cultural relativism was correct, then one cannot even criticize the practices or beliefs of one's own culture. If that is the case, the black South African citizens under the system of apartheid, a policy of racial segregation that privileged the dominant race in a society, could not criticize that official state position. Thirdly, if cultural relativism was correct, then one cannot even accept that moral progress can happen. If that is the case, then the fact that many societies now recognize women's rights and children's rights does not necessarily represent a better situation than before, when societies refused to recognize that women and children even had rights. Heschel concludes his argument by saying that he understands the attractiveness of the idea of cultural relativism for many people that it recognizes the difference between cultures. However, he argues that recognizing and respecting difference between cultures do not necessarily mean that there is no such thing as objective truth in morality. He argues argues he argues certain values in common. Rachel posits that if one sc- scrutinizes the beliefs and practice of different cultures, however far apart they are from each other, no culture, whether in the present world or in the past, would promote murder instead of prohibiting it. This, however, should not be taken as a reconciliation of all differences in the name of some abstract universal value system. The cultural differences between one society and another in terms of norms, practice, and beliefs are not trivial matters that one can disregard. They are actually part of who one is and cannot be set aside. One should instead think of a common human condition, a set of existential situations that human beings share and that are fleshed out through a group's unique set of historical experience and manifested in a group's particular cultural constructions. Thus, the challenge of ethics is not the removal of one's culture because that is what makes one unique. Instead, one must dig deeper into her own culture in order to discover how her own people have most meaningfully explored possibly universal human questions or problems within the particularity of her own people's native ground. Thus, hospitality, for example, may be a species-wide question, but how we Filipinos observe and express hospitality is an insight we Filipinos must explore because it may be in our own practice that we see how best we have responded to this human question. It may be best because we responded especially to the particularity of our own environmental and historical situation. One can then benefit by paying attention to her own unique cultural heritage because doing so may give her a glimpse into the profound ways her people and grappled with the question of what ought I to do. Ethics, therefore, should neither be reduced to one's own cultural standards, nor should it simplistically dismiss one's unique cultural beliefs and practices. The latter can possibly enlighten her toward what is truly ethical. What is important is that one does not wander into ethical situations blindly with the naive assumption that ethical issues will be resolved automatically by her beliefs and traditions. Instead, she should challenge herself to continuously work toward a polar maturity in ethical decision making. Moral development then is a prerequisite if the individual is to encounter ethical situations with a clear mind and with her values properly placed with respect to each other. We shall discuss moral development further, but let us now focus on the relationship between one's religion and the challenge of ethical decision making.
Religion and ethics. Many religious followers assumes that what the religion teaches can be found either in the sacred scriptures, example giving the Bible for the Christians, the Quran for the Muslims, and etc., or the body of the writings, example giving the Vedas, including the Upanishads, the other texts for Hindus, the Tao Te Ching, Zhuang Tzu, and the other Taoist classics for the Taoists, or the other forms or the or in the other forms other than written texts of preachings that their leaders had promulgated and become part of their traditions. The moral agent in question must still, in full responsibility, challenge himself or herself to understand using his or her own powers of rationality, but with the full recognition of his or her own situatedness and what is her or his religion's authorities claim his or her religion teaches. Of course, we have different kinds of religions in this world. So some followers or some religious followers, they assume daw po that the religion teaches can be found either in their sacred scriptures. So that kind of thoughts that they have, it leads to a philosophical questions that can be asked or known as vis-a-vis ethics. Is what exactly does sacred scriptures or religious teachings command? So, katulad nga po nung sinabi ko, we have different kinds of religions in this world. So, katulad ko po, I am a Mormon, and then we have a command that we follow. So, as a followers, meron din akong sariling interpretations or perspectives in life kung paano ko po i-follow yung commands na meron kami. And of course, meron din pong different kinds ng mga followers, which is yung isa, sinusunod niya ang mga commands or teachings na meron ang isang religions kasi ito daw yung sinabi ng Diyos or nakalagay sa scriptures or sa sacred scriptures na meron sila. Yung isa naman is, pinapalaw niya ito kasi alam niyang tama ito or alam niya makakabuti ito sa kanya kung susundin niya yung command or religious teachings na meron sila. Minsan daw po, mas magandang meron tayong philosophical minded para po if ever nasusunod tayo sa command or sa religious teachings na meron tayo, mas malalaman natin kung tama ba ito o mali. Kasi merong mga commands na maglilid sa atin sa kasamaan or mapapahamak tayo pag sinunod natin to. Katulad nga po nung sinabi dito, may example po dito na nung Crusades in European Middle Ages daw po, and European Christians, pinalo po nila or sinunod po nila yung mga sinasabi ng religious leaders teachings doon na nag-lead sa massacre Muslim. So, kung meron po silang philosophical minded, siyempre may isip nila na hindi yun tama kasi hindi yun yung ituturo or nakalagay sa sacred scriptures na meron sila. Ang kahalagahan daw po ng philosophical-minded individual when it comes to religion is you can have a critical-minded na mag-lead po sa inyo para magkaroon kayo ng sariling set of beliefs and practices and to not simply follow for the sake of the blind obedience.
Moral deliberation. American moral psychologist Lawrence Kober theorized that moral development happens in 6 stages, which he divided into 3 levels: pre-conventional, conventional, and post-conventional. So dito naman po sa moral deliberation, it's all about moral developments, which is theorized by Lawrence. So sinabi din po niya na ang moral development ay may 6 stages, which is divided po sa 3 levels. Ito yung pre-conventional, conventional, at post-conventional. Additional lang po sa mga additional dun sa pre-conventional ay post-reasoning is centered, which are Yung first stage po ay reasoning around obedience and the audience of punishment. While yung second stage, it's self-interest. Is reasoning to learn, ito pa yun. Is reasoning and learns to act according to what they think will serve its self-interest. Then yung conventional naman po, conventional, this is the time when one's learn to follow the conventions of each group. So dito naman po sa conventional level, which is divided po sa two stages. The first stages is when one begins to act according to what the larger group, she or he, belongs to accept of itself. While the second stages is when just good for itself, but more importantly, it is necessary for the existence of society itself. So sa last level na, which is ito po yung pinaka highest level po ng moral development, is yung post-conventional. The morally responsible, the rules of one's group. So ang post-conventional level ay divided sa two stages. The first stage is the moral agent. Sees the value of the explicitity or implicity in order to serve what can be considered the common is the highest stage. What can be the common good or what? Ulit nga. First stage is the moral agent sees the values of social contract. The rational agents have arrived at whether explicitly or implicitly in order to serve what can be considered the common good, or what one thought or to honor and follow. And the last stage, which is the highest stage of the moral development, is about that exists even beyond the fifth stage of the social contract, is choosing to perform actions based on these universal ethical principles that one has determined by itself. The significance of studying the different ethical theories and frameworks becomes clear only to the individual who has achieved or is in the process of achieving moral maturity. For someone who is still in Kolbeck's pre-conventional or conventional stages, moral valuation remains a matter of seeking reward or avoiding punishment, or at best a question of following the dictates of the other people. Dito sa sinasabi na dito po naman po sa sinasabing ito, na the one who is well on the way of maturity, na ang different ethical theories and frameworks ay malinaw po isa sa mga individual na kung saan achieve nila yung process ng moral maturity. Part of this maturity is also the realization that ethical thinking is not a completely intellectual task, but one that also involves the feelings.
Feelings in moral deliberation. Aristotle precisely points out that moral virtue goes beyond the mere act of intellectually identifying the right thing to do. Instead, it is the condition of one's character by which the agent is able to manage his/her emotions or feelings.
The mature moral agents realize that she or he is both a product of many forces, elements, and events, all of which shape his/her situation and options for a decision. Instead, a meaningful moral decision is one that she or he makes in full cognizance of where she or he is coming from and of where she or he ought to go.
Moral problems. Aristotle recognizes the importance of continuous habituation in the goal of shaping one's character so that she or he becomes more used to choosing the right thing. A moral individual is always a human being whose intellect remains finite and whose passions remains dynamic, and who is always placed in situations that are unique. There are no automatic moral decisions. One must continue to manage his or her reasons and passions to respond in the best way possible to the kaleidoscope of moral situations that she or he finds himself or herself in. What must a morally mature individual do when she is confronted with moral problems? The first step that we ought to take if there's a potential ethical issue is to, first, determine our level of involvement in the case at hand. Second, identify which activity we are engaged in, whether we are making a judgment on a case that we are not involved in, or if we truly need to make a decision in a situation that demands that we act. Third, identify all the people who may potentially be affected by the implications of a moral situation or by our concrete choice of action. These people are called stakeholders in the particular case. Types of ethical problems or issues. The first one is a situation in which we need to clarify whether a certain action is morally right or morally wrong. The second type involves determining whether a particular action in question can be identified which a generally accepted ethical or unethical action. The third type points to the presence of an ethical dilemma. Dilemmas are ethical situations in which there are competing values that seems to have equal worth. Types of ethical problems or issues. Example, issue of the ethical value of the death penalty. Can we say that death penalty is tantamount to murder? What would be the different ethical theories or frameworks say regarding this issue? There is hardly an ethical problem if the agent's question is clearly about performing a widely considered unethical or immoral action such as, ought I to murder my neighbor? Murder in almost all, if not all, societies is unquestionably one of the worst acts a human being can perform. The situation in question only assumes an ethical identity if, in this case, there is a query as to whether a particular act of killing a human being is tantamount to murder or not.
The value of studying ethical theories and framework. The ethical theories or framework may serve as guideposts, given that they are the best attempts to understand morality that the history of human thought has to offer. Uh, what the responsible moral individual must instead perform is to continuously test the cogency and the coherence of the ethical theory or framework in question against complexity of the concrete experience at hand. So, what then the what then is the role of ethic theories or frameworks in continuing cultivation of one's capacity for moral choice? So, ethical theories are attempts to provide a clear, unified account of what our ethical obligations are. They are attempts, in other words, to tell a single story about what we are obligated to do without referring directly to specific examples. So, at the beginning, we studied already about ethics, which is ethics provide a set of standards for behavior that help us to decide how we ought to act in a range of situations. We can say that ethic is all about making choices and about providing reasons why we should make these decision about what right and wrong. It first provide a summary for the major sources for ethical thinking and then presents a framework for decision making.
Individual or self. In the realm of the self, as noted earlier, one has to pay attention not just on how one deals with oneself, so, but also on how one interacts with other individuals in personal relations. One may respond to the demand for an ethically responsible care for the self by making full use of the four ethical theories or frameworks. For John Stuart Mills, true seemsly a hedonistic theory given its emphasis on maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain, elevates the human element above the animalistic and above the merely selfish. So, Mill builds on the earlier version of the utilitarianism, the one espoused by Jeremy Bentham, so, which first posited that makes an action good is makes that it brings about the greatest happiness for the greatest number. The genius of Bentham was addition of extent, that is, the number of people affected by an action to the list of circumstances that an individual must consider in determining what one ought to do in particular situation. So, the greatest happiness for Bentham then means quantity, but not just for oneself, since the other half of maxim refers to the greatest number that points to the extent of number of people affected by this happiness. Thus, there is no selfish even in Bentham version. So, one's moral or ethical responsibility to herself then is to make sure that everything she does will be for the greatest happiness, not just in number but in kind, and not just for her but for everyone affected by her acts. And for Thomas Aquinas, natural law theory states as its first natural inclination the innate tendency that all human beings share with all other existing things, namely, the natural propensity to maintain oneself in one existence. So, according to Thomas Aquinas of natural theory, any action therefore that sustains and cultivates one biological and physical existence is to be deemed good, which all action that leads to the destruction of one's existence to be called bad or evil. So, Aquinas thus specifies that taking care of one's being is a moral duty that one owes to herself and to God. So, the moral philosophy of Aquinas calls on person to do beyond what she thinks, what she wants, and to do realize instead what her innermost nature inclines her to do, which is the promotion of life, of the truth, and the harmonious coexistence with the others. For Kant's deontology celebrates the rational faculty of the moral agent, which sets it above merely sentient being. So, Kant's principle of irreversibility challenges the moral agent to think beyond her own predilection and desires, and to instead consider what everyone ought to do. His principle of humanity as end itself teachings one to always treat humanity, whether in her own self or in other individual, as the end or goal of all human action and never merely as the means. Kant goes beyond simply telling people to do not use others as instrument. His moral and ethical responsibility to herself is to maintain her dignity as rational agent and thus makes the self-regulator in the realm of normality. She cannot be follower or she cannot be slave on her own selfish desire or of external authority. So, and last, for Aristotle, virtuous ethics teaches one to cultivate her own intellect as well as her character to achieve eudaimonia in her lifetime. So, for Aristotle, one's ethical or moral responsibility to himself is one of self-cultivation. Aristotle is quite forgiving when it comes to individual action, knowing full well the difficulty of hitting the mark in a given moral situation. So, for Aristotle, life is all about learning from one's own experience so that one becomes better a person. But make no mistake about this. One must become a better person and not just live a series of endless mistakes.
Social life in the Philippine context and in the global village. One membership in any society brings forth the demands of communal life in terms of the group rules and regulation. The ethical questions arises when the expectations of a particular society come into conflict with one's most fundamental values. Mill's utilitarian doctrine will always push for the greatest happiness principle as the prime determinant of what can be considered as a good action, whether in the personal sphere or in the social realm. Thus, Filipinos cannot simply assume that their action is good because their culture says so. Thomas Aquinas, on the other hand, in his natural law theory has a clear conception of the principles that should guide the individual in her actions that affect her larger society. Immanuel Kant argues for the use of the principles of universalizability and humanity as end in itself to form a person's autonomous notion of what she ought to do. Aristotle's virtue ethics prescribes mesotes as the guide to all the actions that a person has to take, even in her dealing with the larger community of people.
The non-human environment. Environmental ethics, or human beings' ethical or moral responsibility toward the non-human world, first emerged in the 20th century. The majority of ethical philosophers concentrated on human-to-human relationships rather than human-to-non-human relationships. Some say that applying any of the four ethical theories or frameworks is an exercise in anachronism, combining components from different periods of time. Some believe that because the greatest happiness principle applies to the largest number of creatures who experience pleasure and pain, animals should be included in that number. Animals, on the other hand, are unable to become moral agents since they lack reason and free choice. However, proponents of animal ethics claim that when making moral decisions, people should always consider the possible pleasure or pain that they may experience on animals. Because Kantian deontology emphasizes the human being's inherent dignity as a rational creature, it can be claimed that universalizing maxims that ultimately lead to an unacceptable social existence is impossible. Is it possible to accept the following maxim as a universal rule? One should not be concerned about environmental devastation as long as it generates economic benefit for my society. One could argue that ignoring the environment for short-sighted economic aims will eventually result in disasters such as flooding or famines, which will have a negative effect on society. While Thomas Aquinas may not explicitly discuss the physical environment or human moral obligation to it, one might conclude from his philosophy that some activities should be avoided because they do not result in harmonious, peaceful community. One could argue that Aristotle would agree that a person has a moral responsibility to see beyond their local surroundings. If such is the case, one must go beyond immediate economic needs to ensure that damaging the environment for the sake of doing so may not eventually lead to something far worse. As a result, learning to widen one's perspective in understanding what is just near at hand makes one a better person. The point here is not to force answers, but to be open to real possibilities, as well as real dead ends. One must see the value of testing one's hypothesis, but also the virtue of accepting that some hypotheses need to be let go. What we have tried to show here is possibility, that classical ethical theories contribute to potentially solve 21st century problems.
To sum up, in the end, there's only a beginning. We do not have a computer program here that can automatically calculate what the right thing to do in a given situation. There is only the human individual and his or her community of fellow human beings who need to accept that they must continue to explore the meaning of what is good and right, while hoping to arrive at the best judgment they can make at this point in time, realizing his finitude of human understanding and of the capacity to make choices, but at the same time hoping that one best attempt at doing what is right does mean something in the end. These are part and parcel of making informed moral decisions. Thank you. That's all.